Today we're going to begin discussing our new unit, which is about how our country changed and grew in the years after Reconstruction was finished. So basically the time period that we're looking at is from 1877, which was the official end of Reconstruction with the withdrawal of federal troops from the South, and lasting until our time in World War I, which is when the United States entered in 1917. We're going to begin our discussion this unit, our first lesson, about westward expansion. Our country had already expanded west prior to the Civil War. However, afterwards, there were new waves of white settlers that made their way west in search of a better life. Some of these people were miners, some were cattle ranchers, some were farmers. As they moved out west, they encountered various Native American cultures who had already been pushed west previously in our country's history, such as by President Andrew Jackson's Trail of Tears. So as more white settlers began to move west, there was bound to be further clashes on the prairies, which are located in the central states of our country. Let's take a look first at the culture of many of the Plains Indians and how it differed from that of Americans. You can see here, and this is also found in your book in Chapter 5, Section 1, starting on page 202, that the natives valued very different things than the whites. Their culture was highly developed and distinct, contrasting to how the Americans thought of them. They were able to produce many different items necessary for the survival of the village, as well as tools and clothing. They used horses and guns in combination. They received some of these guns in their interactions with Europeans going back to the 1400s. So they did have a certain amount of guns with them, although they still relied on other weapons such as bows and arrows. A huge thing to understand about the culture of the Plains Indian is the buffalo. The buffalo was used in its entirety as different items needed in the tribes. These different tribes would use the buffalo for not only food, but also as tools. They could use the stomach of a buffalo to carry water around the village. They could obviously use the bones to make into weapons and other types of tools. The hides were used for clothing and also to cover their dwelling structures and their teepees. So the buffalo was used in every part. It was essential to their survival on the plains. The buffalo were hunted with horses, so also the animal, the horse, was extremely significant to the survival of these Plains Indian tribes. The Plains Indians lived in small family groups, and they had ties to other bands of natives. The young men were considered the hunters and warriors and went out on these buffalo hunts. The young women were the one who prepared the meat once it was brought back to the village, and the hides. And basically another big aspect of Plains Indians is their belief that nobody could really own the land, that the land itself was sacred and was to be used by people, but it could not be owned by people. If you've ever seen the movie Dances with Wolves, it has a really good portrayal of the lives of the Plains Indians. So let's see how that contrasted with that of the white settlers. White settlers, unlike Native Americans, believed that you could own land. And in doing so, they could start new mines to try to find more mineral resources such as gold and silver, coal. They could start a business out there or large-scale farms. And so they definitely believed that they could claim parts of land, even if it was being lived on by others, and that they could claim it as their own. And since the natives did not believe that land couldn't be owned, the whites basically felt like the natives kind of gave up their rights or forfeited their rights. They felt like the natives never really improved the land because they didn't build any type of buildings that we would consider to be developed. And so because of that, they just felt like the natives basically gave up any claims whatsoever to the land. Before the Civil War, there was discovery of gold in places like California. There were other places that were rumored to have gold, and people claimed that they had found it after the Civil War. So it's another reason why many settlers began to push westward, in addition to just trying to start their lives over after the war. As many white settlers pushed westward, the government had to step in multiple times because of the threat of Native American attacks. It's easy to understand why the Native Americans would resist white settlers coming out into their land. I mean, after all, they had been pushed out already prior to the Civil War, and now their land is being invaded again. The Native Americans resented the fact that the government would make agreements and treaties and then break those same agreements and treaties. So it really contributed to the distrust that many Native Americans had towards the U.S. government. Along with the arrival of railroads, we saw that the railroads were a central feature for the Union to win the Civil War. After the Civil War was over, there was a final push to really construct railroad tracks across the country so that there could be transcontinental links. As the railroads arrived in these western states and Midwestern states, it became essential for the government to change its policy towards Native Americans because many of these railroad tracks ran right through land that the government had previously said the Native Americans could live on. You can see this change in policy from the year 1834 into the 1850s. In 1834, the government basically said that the Great Plains itself, which covers multiple states, would be one huge reservation. This was a law called the Indian Intercourse Act, and basically it said any native tribes could live in the Great Plains, and that would be considered their homeland. And in 1834, most of our country's attention was focused on the East Coast. This was before the Civil War, and we were still developing ourselves after our independence from Britain and trying to establish ourselves as a country. So we weren't particularly too interested in the West at that point. However, with the discovery of gold and other changes, and then the beginning of railroad track construction, forced the government to look at things a different way. So by the 1850s, what the government did, instead of setting aside one huge area as a reservation, they created treaties with specific tribes that defined specific boundaries for each tribe. And so now Native American tribes were broken apart into different groups and forced to live in those particular locations. You can see a map of the Native American lands and how they got smaller and smaller with these different reservations set aside. If you look on page 205 of your book, the purple areas would represent the reservation lands, and you can see in the top part where it has the three smaller boxes showing different years, how much that land promised to Native shrunk dramatically, and you can see what it is today. It's very small. There was a very unfortunate event that happened in 1864, which was towards the end of the Civil War. Most of our country's attention was focused on that, but there was a massacre that took place, which kind of showed that our government was pushing its way into these Native tribes' areas, and with no regard to civilians, women and children, that had nothing to do with any type of resistance. This massacre was called the Sand Creek Massacre. It occurred in November 29th of 1864. It's sometimes known as the Chivington Massacre because the guy who led it was Colonel John Chivington. He was quoted on page 204 saying, "I want no peace till Indians suffer more." And so therefore his troops descended on this group of natives, Cheyenne Indians, who were simply on their way to their winter camp. Many times Native tribes would alter their places that they lived in depending on the seasons because of crops and availability of buffalo. So on this group of Indians' way to the winter camp, Colonel Chivington and his men massacred approximately 150 of them, many of whom were women and children. And that just shows you the viciousness and the ferocity of these American settlers who felt they had the right to the land and it didn't matter who was in the way. There was a trail that the government had to shut down called the Bozeman Trail, and they closed it down because there were so many fights that were breaking out between these natives and settlers moving out west, showing the frustrations that these natives had. You can see several different massacres that took place because of this on page 205, which is that same map where you saw the amount of native land and how it shrunk. The stars or black points on the map represent where these different massacres took place. Finally, because of all these skirmishes and fights breaking out between natives and settlers, the government created what was called the Treaty of Fort Laramie. And it basically said that the Sioux would agree to live on a reservation off the Missouri River, and the whites therefore would not cross into that area. They would stay off of it, and the natives could the Sioux specifically could kind of do their own thing on that reservation, and with the promise that the whites would never come onto their land. Well, certain people didn't trust the government because of some of these massacres that took place. Sitting Bull, who we've mentioned already in class, was one of the Sioux leaders who refused to sign this Treaty of Fort Laramie because he probably predicted that in the future it would be broken. You can see here a picture of Sitting Bull, and this was a photograph taken of him. And he was one of the most respected leaders of his particular Sioux tribe, the Hunkpama tribe. Those Sioux leaders who did sign the treaty expected that they could continue using this land that was promised to them in this treaty as their traditional hunting grounds. They did not believe the government would take it away, but Sitting Bull definitely did not believe government promises. Here you can see a map showing major battles that took place between Native Americans and white settlers, and they occurred all throughout the western part of our country. Anything with this red star represents a major contest, and you can see where the different Indian tribes were located at this time. One particular Native American leader named Chief Joseph, you can see the route that he took in trying to avoid white settlers and U.S. Army troops who were chasing him. Finally, he was forced to give up in this particular battle right here and was quoted as saying, "I shall fight no more forever," basically realizing that these Native tribes couldn't continue resisting the onslaught of white settlers and Army officials that were coming after them. Let's look at a few other bloody battles that erupted in this time period after Reconstruction. There was the Red River War that happened in 1874 to 1875, and basically it was because the U.S. got involved again in breaking some promises, different lands that had been promised as reservations to Native Americans. The U.S. decided to move certain tribes to different locations and open fire on other tribes. And so therefore there was warfare that broke out in some of the areas of the Southwest. Probably one of the most famous Indian wars was nicknamed Custer's Last Stand, but it's officially the Battle of Little Bighorn. It was in the state of South Dakota. At that time it was a territory. But basically what happened was white settlers had reached that location and claimed to have found gold, even though that location, which is the Black Hills area of South Dakota, had already been promised to certain tribes like the Sioux, the Cheyenne, and the Arapaho from that Treaty of Fort Laramie. And so therefore, the whites felt that that was not a problem, and they could still go out onto this land to try to find this gold and get as much as they could. General George Custer was one of the leaders of the white settlers moving out onto this land and wanting to take control of it. Some of the native tribes in this area that saw their land being violated, even though it had been promised to them, were the Sioux and Cheyenne. They assembled a group of warriors and met General Custer and his troops in this Battle of Little Bighorn. It took place in June of 1876. The significance of it was that General Custer and all his men were killed in this battle by these Sioux and Cheyenne warriors. So literally it was Custer's last stand. But later, unfortunately for the natives, more U.S. troops were sent out to quell the rebellion and these native tribes. And so finally by late 1876, which was about 6 months after the battle started, the Sioux were later beaten into submission. So they got an initial victory, but later a defeat. Finally, we talked a little bit in class about what assimilation is. As more white settlers moved out west, they felt like they could lessen the conflicts breaking out if Native Americans would just simply be not Native American anymore. If they could become more like the whites in their culture, there wouldn't be so many conflicts. So this idea of assimilation was brought about in our government, and many laws and acts were created from it. The Dawes Act, or also called the Dawes Severalty Act, basically broke up tribal reservations into individual pieces of land for individual families. So the idea is that if they couldn't work together as one big tribe and they were separated by families, they'd be less likely to rise up. They were promised money in a part of this agreement, which they never received. You can see how much land was given. Also, buffalo started to decline in huge numbers as another way to break native culture. They were hunted for sport by white settlers and tourists and fur traders, almost to the point of extinction, which would spell death for the natives' way of life. Also, there were entertainers out to make a profit, such as Buffalo Bill Cody, who was responsible himself for millions of buffalo being killed just to have use in his different shows that he put on across the West. Finally, the last major Indian war was the Battle of Wounded Knee. This was the last of the major Indian wars. It occurred in 1890 with the result of nearly 300 deaths, mostly again of women and children. They were brutally massacred. It was the signal that the frontier was now officially closed, that it had been settled finally once and for all by whites, and natives could no longer put up a resistance. The reason it started was because many white military leaders were concerned about something that was called the ghost dance, which was a native ritual which said that if natives practiced it, they would eventually get back their lands and ways of life. And so whites saw it as a threat. They didn't want natives to practice this ghost dance. And finally, there was the war that broke out in December 28th of 1890. Many people died as a result, but this battle did officially end the Indian War period, and Sitting Bull was killed because of being arrested in this particular battle. So this shows that the white settlers moving out west were moving to better their lives, but at the expense of the Native Americans.